Hi there, and welcome to World History. In particular, we're looking at modern world history, and we're going to start this modern world history survey course with a little bit of a discussion about the Renaissance time period. So, let's get started. So, first of all, in order to understand what the Renaissance is, we kind of need to know what was happening in the time leading up to the Renaissance. So, this word Renaissance actually means rebirth. All right. So we're talking about a rebirth in Greek and Roman culture, and the learning, the art, the architecture, all these things began to kind of be brought back to the forefront of European culture during this period of the Renaissance. We also see an explosion of art and learning. All right. And this also began in Italy. And sometimes you'll see this called the Italian Renaissance or the Southern Renaissance because of that. Later, it's going to diffuse into the rest of Europe. All right. So the Middle Ages was a time where people didn't get around very much. They were usually serfs. All right. A serf is a person who is bound to the land where they serve. And they always work on land owned by a very rich landowner called a lord, who usually lived in a manor village. All right, so as you can imagine, most middle-aged village goers were usually peasants. They didn't live very long. They lived in straw and wood huts and houses and things like this. All right, and so people didn't travel that much unless maybe you were nobility and you were able to travel from city to city. And so this is how people were living. But then this period known as the Crusades occurred. All right, and the Crusades were a series of wars between Europe's Christian countries like France and Britain, and the Muslim kingdoms that had taken over or begun to I guess challenge the Constantinople or the Byzantines for control over the Holy Lands. So you start to see trade emerge between Europe and Asia. And this is going to bring back ancient ideas that were preserved by the Byzantines and the Arabs. Now, when I say bring back ancient ideas, we are talking about the bringing back of the Greek and Roman culture that we were just talking about, that we were just now discussing. All right? And so this is kind of what we're looking at that's going on simultaneously with this Renaissance, I guess leading up to this Renaissance period. But then, right in the middle of the Crusades, you start to see these outbreaks of bubonic plague, and they got kind of the worst they're going to get around the 1300s. And the plague ends up killing so many people that the population in Europe dropped by about 1/3 overall. And sometimes you might see where in certain villages or certain places that the population dropped even more than that, which led to scarcity of jobs. I guess one of the natural progressions of that is if there's not enough people to replace the jobs that are lost due to people dying, well, then they are able to ask for higher wages, which is going to lead to a new middle class. And then you're going to see more interactions ultimately between cities, which is going to lead to this spread of Renaissance ideas. Now that brings us to, again, back to Italy. And around late 1400s, early 1500s, when the Renaissance really begins to emerge, and it starts really first at these city-states. And you see, I've listed out a few of them. I've listed out Florence and Venice and Milan. All right, now Venice is the city of, I guess a city-state by definition is going to be the city and the surrounding areas, and these are going to be political units, just like states today, just like countries today are governed by their own government with their own governing body. These city-states were governed by a sovereign ruler and by a sovereign government. So they controlled the city itself and then the territory around it. So if you're looking at a map of Italy during this time period, you might see an area called the Papal States, or any political map is going to show that there are many different, I guess, political units that make up what is today the country of Italy. And those were then the city-states. Now, looking at Florence in particular, kind of as a case study, Florence would have been a Republican-style government, right? Now, what we mean by Republican isn't the same as, Democrat and Republican. What we mean by that is that it was a city with a government that was established by elected officials that would then rule on the people's behalf. But here's the problem with that, is that these elected leaders, right, they were controlled by usually a very wealthy, powerful individual that controlled more like a dictator than like a leader of a Republican-style government. So you could elect your officials all day, but those officials were elected basically to serve this guy, whose name is Cosimo de' Medici. All right, Cosimo de' Medici. And Cosimo was a very wealthy banker. In fact, at one point, I want to say that he was considered the richest man in Europe, probably even in all the world, but definitely in Europe, he was richer than like the king of France and the king of Britain and so on. Cosimo's grandson was Lorenzo the Magnificent, who took over for Cosimo and was also known as a great patron of the arts. So this word patron, all right, I would definitely be familiar with that for the test. And what that means is that a patron is someone who is going to pay to sponsor something, all right? So in this case, they are sponsoring artists to draw or I guess to paint or make sculptures or whatever it is they want done. So here's the bottom line. If you're an artist or a sculptor, you're not going to be able to live your life doing that work unless someone is able to pay you to do it. So there has to be a demand, and there has to be a lot of people with the money it takes to hire out artists to create these magnificent displays over the periods of days or hours or weeks or whatever it is it's going to take. And so you start seeing these individuals like the rich Medici family and other patrons of the arts. They're going to start paying people like Leonardo da Vinci, for example, or among others, to create very magnificent works of art so that they can buy it and show them off as a symbol of their wealth. All right, it symbolizes their vast wealth. All right, and so because you've got these rich people who have a lot of political power, a lot of money, they can pay artists to do a lot of work. The art begins to kind of represent a new era. Okay, so you start to see new things emerge. And because of the Renaissance time period in and of itself, which is constituted by more than just a few paintings, but also like a culture, an attitude towards religion, an attitude towards our place in the world, an attitude towards new ideas, you start to see this movement called humanism begins to emerge. All right. Now, humanism, it really is the driving force of the Renaissance. You definitely need to know what we mean when we talk about humanism. It focuses on human potential and achievements. It's based in the Greco-Roman tradition, in other words, based on Greek and Roman culture. And it also led to the study of the classics. This should be led to the study of classics. And when we talk about classics, we mean like books such as the Odyssey and the Iliad that you might read in your English class. These are going to be poems and epics and different types of histories and stuff that talk about the heroics of fantastic human beings that do magnificent things, which again kind of focuses on this potential and achievements that we're looking at. So another thing about humanism is that the focus was usually secular, at least in terms of what people are able to do. So when you look at Achilles in the Iliad, and you see his magnificent fighting ability and how he does all the great heroic things he does for the Greeks during the Trojan War, that isn't because God gifted him necessarily. Yeah, he was considered a demigod, but the fact of the matter is, the focus is on what he was able to do. So what the secular focus here means is that people wanted to live well on earth, not just focus on heaven. And they did this in many cases by glorifying what they were capable of. All right, by glorifying what they were capable of, not necessarily by saying, well, if I were to take credit for my singing or for my art or for whatever it might be, I'm taking that credit away from God, or I'm taking it at God's expense. So secular is a word that means worldly, all right, worldly, as opposed to Christian, all right. So something that is, I'm going to X out Christian, not because they weren't Christian, but because they focused on living their lives, not necessarily on giving credit to God in everything they did, which was one of the major characteristics of the Middle Ages. So you start to see this kind of an attitude about how humanism is to be applied to men, as well as how humanism is to be applied to women. And this manifests itself in the differences between a Renaissance man and a Renaissance woman. So men were expected to excel in many fields of study. Men were expected to be good artists, poets. They were supposed to be physically fit and good at sports and horseback riding or whatever it might be. They should be expected to excel at public speaking and know a lot about politics. So you can imagine that not everyone is going to be a Renaissance man. This is still going to be something that is mainly exclusive to your upper classes, your nobility, and your people who live in cities primarily. But it is something that's going to, you see more and more people engaging in this secular focus and trying to just know a lot of stuff about the world in which they live. For Renaissance women, they were not soror ladies expected to excel in the same ways as men were, but rather than talk about politics and public speaking and things, they were supposed to be well versed in the classics, so have the kind of same Roman and Greek knowledge base, be well educated, and inspire art. Now there were going to be some female artists, and we're going to talk about them, but the focus here is mainly geared towards the women being the inspiration for art, many times the subject matter for art, but they're not necessarily expected to produce it in the same way that men would have been. All right, so let's look at the artistic revolution. And in particular, what we're looking at is perspective painting here. All right, so one of the things that you start to see during the Renaissance movement is the idea that they want to create a feeling of depth within the two-dimensional canvas, and they do this by using like a center point, as you can see here in my image. I'm gonna try to make it stand out. Let's see if I can make it stand out here. And use green. This right here would be more or less the focal point of the image. The vanishing point is what we're gonna call it. And what the artists would do is they would make the background kind of line up towards this one vanishing point, which would create depth. So you can see how I've created lines that kind of go along the angles of the floor, all the way intersecting mostly. I mean, my handwriting's pretty bad. The picture is not totally clear, but they intersect more or less with that focal point, that vanishing point. And when you are able to create art that does this, it ends up looking like a three-dimensional image. So you can see that they drew this landscape, and then they were able to draw smaller people in the background to give it a level of depth that you had not been able to see prior to the Renaissance. The emphasis was also on realism, both in art as well as in sculpture. And so you see examples of realism being emphasized in the amount of detail and the accurate proportions of the human body. So you begin to see a lot of artistic nudes being produced. On the left here, I've shown you Donatello's David statue, very, very well known. I want to say a copy of perhaps a Greek or a Roman, copy based on the Greek and Roman, sculpture model. The emphasis being on, again, humanism. But as you can see, it's a very different, very stark contrast and a more effeminate version of David than what you're going to see in the one y'all are probably mostly familiar with, which is Michelangelo's David. And Michelangelo's David, again, both here are nudes. Again, you can see that he looks a little older. He's got very, very well-defined muscles, very, very confident pose as he holds his sling over his shoulder. Again, the detail to the human body and the human potential and achievements manifested through the intricate details in the art itself. You've got the Mona Lisa, all right, one of the most renowned world pieces of art today by Leonardo da Vinci, is sheltered in France in the Louvre, a museum in Paris. And so, again, the emphasis on the realism, the smile that everyone's always talking about. You never really know what she's thinking. A very, very realistic approach. Usually you might have more of a stoic face, like you might see with Raphael's Madonna. But Leonardo captured an image here with so much personality. It leaves people questioning what exactly is it that she is thinking. Raphael, who was very, very well known for his Madonna and Child images. This here is just one of many different Madonna and Child. When we're talking about Madonna and Child, the Madonna image that we're looking at is it looks like my pen is not going to work for me at the moment. The Madonna image we're looking at is another word mainly for Mary, right? The mother of Jesus. So when we talk about Madonna, we're talking about Mary in that context. We've all heard of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. He painted this on the ceiling of that church, and so you can see all these intricate designs within the. Here is Adam touching the finger of God, and God breathing life into Adam, that I think we usually associate with the Sistine Chapel. But do know that the art is far more than just that one image. All of this is Michelangelo's art, and all of them tell different stories of the Bible and whatnot. And then you've also got the science. So Leonardo was a true Renaissance man in that he was not just an artist, but he was also a scientist who had created blueprints for flying machines, as you can see here. And we never saw this work in his time, in his lifespan, unless you were, playing Assassin's Creed. But nevertheless, he was very much a thinker. He wrote all of his work in reverse order for whatever reason. And so you see where Leonardo was, not only was he trying to work with the science of invention, but he also worked in biology and dissected cadavers. He was one of the few during his time that was getting into this kind of thing in order to learn more about the human body directly from the human body, which is very, very liberal even for his time period. There are some female exceptions. All right, so remember we mentioned up above that females were not expected to be artists, but rather to inspire it. Well, you do have different artists like Artemisia Gentileschi, as well as Anguissola, who were both female artists, very, very well known for, in particular with Gentileschi, depicting heroic women. So if you look, you've got two different pictures of the same scene from the Bible. And here is Judith beheading Holofernes. And this here is the Artemisia Gentileschi version of that, all right? And over here, you've got Judith beheading Holofernes, which is the Caravaggio version. And both of them are, expert artists. But if you notice, Caravaggio's, the person that he's depicting here, his image that he's depicting for the heroine, she seems unsure, almost scared, if you will. And over here, she's very, very determined. She's really sawing down hard. You got blood spatter. Her assistant is in the mix, actively helping with holding the powerful man down so that she can cut his head off with her own blade. Over here, it looks like I cut her off, but the maid is standing behind Artemisia. She's an old hag, and she's just holding a bag. And it almost doesn't look realistic that Judith is strong enough to hold him by the hair and cut his neck without him resisting and being able to overtake her. So that's the difference between Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith and Caravaggio's Judith. So, and we just talked about this, but the main difference you see between the paintings, I would call it girl power for real. So, that there ends our discussion of Renaissance humanism and Southern Renaissance art. What we're going to do next time we meet is we're going to discuss humanism in literature and begin looking at how writing was transformed, and then we'll transition from there into the diffusion of humanism and Renaissance art into the North and the rest of Europe. Thanks for watching.